All right, I want to thank everybody for coming to this session on weed management. You're going to have two speakers here, and we're going to do our own introductions. So my name is Daren Bohannan. I'm with Bayer CropScience. I'm the tech service rep for Illinois, north of 70 all the way through to Wisconsin now. I work with the University of Illinois. I do not work with Brian any longer. I have a counterpart down there that does. I work with Western Illinois, University of Illinois, and now the UW. My background is weed science, but as you know from Bayer's portfolio, we sell everything from insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, and seed treatments. But we're going to focus today on my favorite topic, which is weed science. And I'm going to start out with this slide that you see here. You're going to see more of this in the future out of Bayer and different advertising, but this is Respect the Rotation is a trademark initiative that Bayer started about 3 or 4 years ago, started in the Mid-South with a lot of education and training on not just controlling weeds in the field, but managing populations of weeds and managing the diversity that you have in the fields by using more than one tactic or one herbicide. All right. So I'll talk about Respect the Rotation off and on throughout the topic or the talk today, and you'll know that I'm not talking about rotating the crops as much as rotating the herbicides. So the particular challenge that we're faced with right now is weed resistance. It's a growing problem, not just for the farmers in the South or the Mid-South. In fact, 8 or 9 years ago, Dr. Stanley Culpepper came up from Georgia and spoke to us at our ag conference at the U of I on January 1st or 2nd or something like that, and talked about how terrible weed control was in Georgia and how we needed to start changing our ways. And that didn't really pan out very well because everybody in the Mid-South kept doing what they were doing and ignored Georgia. And now you drive through Arkansas in the summertime and it's a very different looking diversity out there, crops, but a diversity of weeds in your crop. And some of these problems have now afforded us the luxury of getting to spray fields more than once. The luxury of maybe getting to know our crop a little better. I mean, who needs to scout when you're out there with a hoe in your hand chopping weeds, right? Think you know what's going on in the field, okay? It's also caused reductions in yields, and in some cases in the South, there's been abandonment or entire crops destroyed in order to eliminate the weeds for that particular year. So, and not only that, but something that we need to keep in mind besides the cost of the current year losses due to poor weed performance or weed control in resistant situations, it also is tying up some cost in land. It's causing land values or rents to be increased because of the population of weeds that are on that farm. There's documented cases in Arkansas and the Mid-South where land values have went down due to a weed resistance problem on a farm that's no longer controlled economically, all right? And then something that maybe a lot of us don't think much about, but in many parts of the U.S. we are very deep into conservation tillage or no-till, and because of these weed resistance problems, we've had to revert back to using some tillage, and that may not be good economically as well as ecologically for our farming practices. So just some things to keep in mind. When I talk about respect the rotation, I want you, anytime I say that, I want you to think of these 4 R's, okay? It's the 4 basic R's of what we're going to have to do in the future to have effective weed management control. And those R's are rotate modes of action, rotate crops, and keep in mind that even if you're rotating crops, but the trait is the same in both crops, you're going to have the tendency to use the same herbicide, so we need to rotate those herbicide traits. Now, as of today, you really have 2 choices. Besides conventional bean, you've got Roundup Ready or Liberty Link. In the future, there will be HPPD beans that we will offer that are resistant to the HPPDs. Syngenta will have those types of beans, and Monsanto and Dow will have growth regulator resistant soybeans that you'll be able to use a dicamba or 2,4-D on. So in the future, you'll have more diversity in what you can rotate to. And then finally, the 4th R, and this is the one that I put in here. If any of you purchased Liberty Link soybeans over the last couple years, we would have given you a trait manual that came with your beans when you sell those beans, right, Mark? If that, you open up that trait manual, little wire-bound thing, the first tab in it is IWM, Integrated Weed Management. This presentation is right out of that book that we wrote, okay? I added this fourth R. We talk about the 3 R's in the book. I think the fourth R needs to be residuals. We need to be getting back to the basics of weed control. All right, so what we've done in the last 15 years, okay, I come out of grad school in the mid-90s. Roundup was about ready to hit the market. And I could tell you a lot of ways to prescription farm your weed control in corn and soybeans then. You know, what adjuvant to put with what product based on what the temperature was that day. Okay, then Roundup came along. We didn't need no prescription. There was no prescription. It was Roundup any day, any time, any size of weed with any sprayer, right? Streak the field, we don't care. Throw in as much adjuvant or as much drift retardant as you can to make these huge droplets. It don't matter. Glyphosate's forgiving. Water hemp's not. Okay? So, we need to start getting back to the basics. Know your weeds. Know something about them. I talk about identifying driver weeds. This is key. Sure, that farm has many different species on it, but which is the driver weed? Which is the one that you need to keep the closest eye on and make your management plan around that driver weed? For those of us in central Illinois and southern Illinois, it's probably water hemp. Get further north here, maybe giant ragweed. Get maybe a little bit into the center part of the state, maybe woolly cupgrass is one of those. But we have to focus on that driver weed. And we need to scout for weed escapes, and we need to remove them. I'm going to talk about why that's so important later. When I say know your weeds, I mean know your weeds. Like, when do they normally germinate? When does that species germinate? How long does it germinate? How deep does it germinate? Will it germinate on the soil surface? How many seeds does it produce? Is it dioecious? Oops, there's a big word. All right. Dioecious means, does it produce male plants and female plants? Because that's going to play a lot in the ecological progress of that particular weed as far as its outcrossings capability. How long does it flower? How quick is the seed viable once it does flower? All right? Understand your cultural practices and how they influence weed management. In other words, you know, what is your tillage? What is your crop rotation? Are you rotating your traits in those crops? When do you plant? What's your row spacing? What type of plant are you planting? In case of beans, is it a tall bushy plant? A tall plant, skinny, or is it a wide body bushy? All those factors, because at the end of the day, this is what we're trying to get to. 90% or greater light interception of the soil produces no more weeds, okay? So we got to know how long to get to that point that we need to have effective control, whether it be post-emergence or residual. And I will preach that it needs to be more residual than post. Okay, Larry Steckel will tell you in Tennessee, he's got a big slide at the beginning of his presentations that says, total post-weed control management is over. Turn off the lights, go home. It's over. We have to be using these residuals. When I talk about peak weed emergence here, this is a slide I stole back in the 90s when water hemp wasn't even all that prolific in Iowa. But you can see here the different peak times in Iowa that they found that these weeds germinate. And look at water hemp's out here a little bit later, but I will tell you this is a bit deceiving, because what we know about it today that we didn't know about it back then was it will germinate clear back. In fact, as warm as this winter's been, I predict to see some water hemp probably coming up by the end of March in some parts of Illinois. And it'll germinate clear into August. Okay? I hold a lot of plot tours in August at my farm, because everybody likes to come out and bake in the sun in August, right? And I like to clean up my alleys a little bit with a tiller, you know, so they're nice and black and there's no weeds in them. Mainly some of my sales reps get some dirt on their shoes and not that stuff at the golf course. So they're out there walking around and they're going, Daren, when'd you till? Oh, Monday. And this is a Thursday. There's water hemp coming up. Yeah, we got a little rain shower the other night. So, I mean, this particular weed can germinate way late into the season, okay? In fact, I've seen it growing in cracks of sidewalks that big and it's flowering, okay? So it is definitely the driver weed. Indications, though, that you have a potential problem. Now, back up a little bit. Stanley told us several years ago that we were going to have a problem if we didn't change our evil ways, okay? But it took 10 years to get here, right? No, really it didn't. It took about 5 years. In the last 5 years, we've been in denial, okay? So these are the indications that you might have. You know what? I've done a great job. I'll brag about myself and all the future former tech reps for other companies. We've done a great job of training our sales force to go on your farm and tell you that the herbicide didn't fail. It was the weather. It was too hot, too dry, too cold, too wet. You're right. We've done that. I've done a great job of doing that. We have to start realizing that maybe that escape wasn't because it was too hot, too dry, too cold, wet. Maybe it's resistant. Maybe it's a mutant. It's a survivor. Okay? So I'll fault our industry for this problem right up front. We've been slow to realize that there's a problem, and it's not related to the weather. Okay? So, you know, you start out with one weed. You know, that's the best investment you can make on spreading weeds is called a combine. It does the best job of spreading weeds across the field. $250,000 weed spreader, all right? So one weed escape turns into a patch the next year. So then in year 2, who do you blame? It's the sprayer, right? He missed this spot. But we'll just go ahead and combine it. So now the patch grows. And it's usually the 3rd or 4th year that you have the resistance on your farm that you wake up and go, Houston, we have a problem, okay? At that point, it's too late. We need to recognize these situations in year 1, okay? And I'll talk a little bit in a little bit about zero tolerance. Many weed species are managed, but one particular weed gets out of control. So in other words, you go out in this field and all the ragweeds are dead, and 20% of the water hemp's still alive, and you go, oh, it's too hot, or it's too dry, or it's too... No. That's a good indication. If one species had just a few escapes, those probably are resistant. We got to jump to that conclusion. So, confirmed glyphosate-resistant weeds. Currently, this is a list that's growing. There's 10 of them right here in the U.S. I think the driver for us is, like I said, water hemp. This is most frequently sprayed weeds in soybeans. This is survey work that's done by the universities. And you can see here in soybeans, we've got 4 confirmed and 2 maybes. And in corn, we got 5 confirmed and 1 maybe. All right? The key is starting with a clean field. Now that's tillage possibly, or that's effective burn down. And that could be still utilizing glyphosate, but it may be using a tank mix partner. All right? And then residuals. Overlapping residuals. Larry and the guys down in the south talk a lot about overlapping residuals. They have a much longer growing season than we have, so they may put a residual out pre. They may go early post with their Roundup or with their post product and put a residual with that, and they may come in a 3rd time even with a residual. We may not need to do that because of the length of time of our growing season. And again, I just can't reiterate more or enough the need for more residuals, and not just a cut rate, not a setup rate. We all know what setup rates are, right? It's a rate that we want to break so that we can use the value of our post product that we're paying for that trait, right? Well, that may not be the best way to manage weeds. Apply it actively growing weeds, apply it the right timing for that weed size, use the right application technique, because after all, you know, post-emergence products besides glyphosate are a little bit different, right? Make sure you got coverage, coverage, and coverage. So droplet size, spray tips, speed of the equipment, all that stuff needs to be dialed in. What a difference 2 days makes. I borrowed, stole, however you want to say it, this from Dr. Larry Steckel's presentation this summer, but this is one of his producers down in Tennessee who sprayed this portion of the field on the right with FlexStar at the appropriate rate, 3 inches, and for some reason had to stop spraying. I don't know if it was rain or there was a funeral or it just got dark and he didn't come back for 2 days.
He said he went to lunch.
Went to lunch. Well, they do take longer lunches down there, I will admit that. Not like the Europeans, though. If you're going to go to France and you're going to have dinner, you're going to do it for 2 hours, whether you like it or not. But he came back 2 days later and he applied FlexStar. Same rate, same sprayer, everything. The difference was the rate was appropriate for that size of palmer the day he was in there the first time. It wasn't the second time. So we're going to talk a little about incorrect reasons why. Now there are 2 reasons, 2 basic reasons why you'd be using well, 2 inches a day is what Dr. Steckel says. I think we would, in Illinois, we would say that water hemp grows about 1.5 inches a day. So they're both very worthy adversaries, okay?
And you could go out and label real quick.
Right. Right. So, and that leads me into there's 2 basic ways that we end up using the incorrect rate. If we use low rates, the reason we talk about low rates and weed resistance or resistance of any biological organism for that matter is if you cut the rate some of that organism may survive, whether it's a germ or a pathogen or a weed, and it's probably got some genetic reason why. And it's probably going to pass that characteristic on, and eventually you develop tolerance, okay, which then becomes full-blown resistance. There are two basic ways that that can occur. One can be a conscious decision that you are making, and that is, I'm only going to use a half a rate because I ain't paying more than $10. That's what fits my budget, right? The wallet. That's a conscious decision you're making. Or it could be, I used the full rate last year and got great control. I think I can do 75% and get the same control this year. That's a conscious decision you made. But there's a whole lot of other ways that you end up reducing the rate that you don't even think about. Okay? Spraying on a windy day and putting a drip retardant in there just because you want to spray on a windy day, and the drip retardant creates big droplets that roll off the leaf and hit the soil. This is a post-emergence product. We don't want it on the soil, we want it on the leaf. So if 20% of that deposition hits the soil, guess what? You just reduce the rate 20%. Or you spray on a windy day without one, and it's real hot, and some of the spray evaporates. You've just reduced your rate. You didn't mean to, you did. You scouted it on Monday, and this is the size of the weeds, so this is the appropriate rate. Sprayer doesn't get there till Thursday. The weeds didn't wait. Okay? Okay? So those are all things that we have to start becoming more aware of. Not in every case have I ran into a producer with weed resistance that he consciously developed it because he cut the rate. I've had many producers say, I've been using full rates. But then I start asking, well, how often do you spray with a drip retardant? I always spray with a drip retardant. It's good insurance. No, it's not. It's bad practice. On a windy day, it's good insurance. On a calm day, it's bad practice. Okay? So, we got to be aware of those. I'm going to spend just a few minutes here talking about zero tolerance. It's something that the guys in the Mid-South and Stanley Culpepper in Georgia will talk about in every one of their meetings and have for a couple years. But I want you to notice the date of this press release is April 2001. So this is not a new concept. This professor out of UC, University of California, a guy by the name of Dr. Robert Norris, I found this publication actually about 5 years ago when I was doing a talk for the Anaheim, the Commodity Classic when it was in Anaheim, I think in 06, 05 maybe. And I ran across this guy's article, and he was talking about zero tolerance then. Now, how many of you in 2001 were worried about glyphosate-resistant weeds? I mean, be honest, nobody was. I wasn't either. I mean, I'm a weed scientist. I knew it would come eventually, but I wasn't worried about it then. He was already at that point saying that weed science has made a major tactical error in adopting this principle of integrated pest management, that a few weeds can escape. Okay? He said we took what the entomologist had taught us about thresholds on insects and we tried to paint a broad brush and say that will work for weed science too. The difference is, and this is an example, he uses a grower, a large cotton grower in California that had been using this principle clear back to 1967 based on some work that the UC Davis staff did way back then. But he said here's one of the fundamental flaws. Insects typically only reproduce a few hundred offspring per female per year. We have a single water hemp plant. If it's growing out without any weed competition around or any crop or anything, it's got full sunlight and ample moisture, it'll produce 1 million seeds. And remember I said that big word dioecious? So there's 1 million flowers on there and she don't produce no pollen. So how many pollen donors could she viably have? 1 million. So we could have 1 million crosses out of one plant. She could get pollen from 1 million different plants. She probably doesn't, but she can. Okay? So those are some fundamental things that we overlooked in weed science through the 80s and 90s, saying, oh, well, we're just like an entomologist. We can let you have so many weeds and it still doesn't impact yield. Wrong. Because of the propensity for these things to produce seed. All right. I'm going to step off of his pedestal for a minute, but he does talk about this wildfire paradigm. It's much easier to control a fire, right, when it's small than letting it get out of control. So either don't let the fire start at all, or if it does, you stop it in year one. So that's when I normally up here would have my prop, which is my hoe, all right? We see one escape. Normally we would say, oh, don't worry about it, it doesn't impact yield. I'd go hoe it. I wouldn't let it produce seed. We need to start proactively thinking about it as it's resistant. That's why it's out there. It's not because it was too hot, too dry, too cold, too wet. So don't allow weed resistance to start on your farm in the first place. We've got to incorporate these residuals. We've got to remove seed. He goes on in the South, and this is in our trait manual, talking about practicing predation. What's predation? If something does produce seed, make sure you get rid of the seed. Whether you windrow the weeds at the end of the day and burn them, or you bury them, or you haul them out of the field. But you don't let the seed stay there. Don't let that combine become a $250,000 weed spreader. Clean up that equipment. If you do have one failure one year in a field, maybe harvest that one last. Then do a thorough job of cleaning that combine before you put it back in the field the following season. So, in summary, respect the rotation. This is really an industry-wide initiative. Bayer's trying to lead this. It's our trademark and our name, but really it's all of our industry has to start adapting these practices and thinking about rotating our modes of action, our crops, our traits, and getting back to overlaying residuals in our programs. Because the over-reliance of any single weed management practice, there's one exception. There's one exception that you will never develop resistance to. The hoe, okay? Everything else, Mother Nature has more diversity than we're throwing at it. I like to use this real simple analogy. When I talk to most farmers, and have for my entire career, what do you want in your weed control? They want cheap, they want easy, they want convenient, right? They want simple. It's like me asking my kid, what do you want for dinner tonight? It's pizza and ice cream. It'll be that every night. But that's not what I feed them. Right? So what we want and what we need are two different things. What we want is simple, easy, convenient, cheap. What we need is diversity, because Mother Nature goes right around. Simple, easy, cheap. Okay? So what I'm up here to tell you today is, if you want to switch to some of our products that Bayer sells, don't use them the same way you use them in Roundup or glyphosate or the ALSs of the past. Okay? We don't have any resistance right now to Liberty, but that I'd be telling you a big lie in front of Abe here if I said that won't happen, because it will. So we need to realize over-reliance on a single mode is a problem. Any questions?